Opening the door for kingside development, this knight leap aims to control central squares and prepare for a flexible pawn structure. Developing a knight mirrors white's opening, setting up a symmetrical pawn structure and a balanced struggle for central influence. Opening the center strategically, c4 aims to control key squares and create dynamic play. Black prepares to fianchetto their bishop, aiming for a robust kingside defense and a flexible pawn structure. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, this move gently expands white's queenside influence while maintaining flexibility. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the fianchetto and prepares for castling into safety. Anchoring the bishop on this diagonal opens lines for a potential kingside attack and strengthens control over central squares. Securing the king instantly clears the path for queenside expansion and potential knight repositioning. Solidifying the kingside structure, preparing for a potential e4 push while maintaining flexibility. Developing the central pawn now aims to challenge white's queenside space and prepare for central piece activity. Solidifying the fianchetto, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn storm or to exert pressure on black's queenside if the game shifts. It also helps control the central dark squares, a crucial element in this king's Indian reversed setup, ensuring pieces are harmoniously placed for future maneuvers. Boldly seizing central space, black challenges white's king's pawn structure and opens avenues for their bishop and queen, signaling an immediate intent to contest control of the crucial e5 square. This aggressive pawn push forces white to consider their own central presence and can lead to dynamic play if met directly. Solidifying the center and preparing for king safety with castling is a natural response, ensuring the monarch finds a secure haven behind a pawn wall, while simultaneously activating the rook to its most potent central file. Asserting central presence, black immediately contests the d4 square, a sensible reaction to white's fianchetto and pawn advances. Rationale, this move fulfills multiple objectives simultaneously. Central control, black's knight directly challenges white's pawn structure in the center, aiming to prevent white from establishing complete dominance. Development, it brings another piece into play, preparing for further coordination and potential attacks. Flexibility, the knight on c6 is well placed to support a future d5 pawn push or to maneuver to other squares depending on white's response. This move signals black's intention to play actively and not cede too much space. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside advance, this knight redeployment subtly contests crucial squares while maintaining flexibility for future development. Shifting the knight to the edge, a bold redeployment, aims to challenge white's queenside control and potentially disrupt the castled king's safety through a future f5 maneuver. This creates interesting tactical possibilities, forcing white to carefully consider their pawn structure and piece activity in response to this unconventional knight placement. Developing the king's pawn to e3 shores up the center, reinforcing the knight on c3 and preparing for a potential d4 pawn push, while also opening a diagonal for the queen. Unleashing the f-pawn challenges the central structure, aiming to create dynamic attacking chances and potentially open lines towards the white king, a bold offensive commitment that might leave the queenside somewhat underdeveloped if not carefully supported. Reinforcing the central pawn chain, this solidifies white's pawn structure and opens avenues for the queen to support the kingside if needed. Pushing the g-pawn aggressively initiates a pawn storm, aiming to disrupt white's kingside and potentially open lines towards the monarch. However, this ambitious advance comes with inherent risks, potentially weakening the dark squares around black's king and creating long-term structural vulnerabilities if not supported properly. A subtle repositioning, this knight's journey to e1 is a pivot from the kingside skirmish, aiming to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, or a regrouping to shore up defenses against black's encroaching pawn storm. Unleashing the knight with such forward momentum might seem aggressive, but it precariously exposes the king's flank and potentially weakens central control as the queenside remains underdeveloped. Opening the f-file with this pawn thrust signals white's intent to potentially challenge black's ambitious kingside pawn storm, creating a dynamic imbalance and forcing black to reevaluate the safety of their monarch nestled behind that advanced wall of pawns. Initiating a retreat to regroup forces, this knight repositions to a more active square, reinforcing the kingside pawn chain and preparing for potential counterplay on the kingside. Unleashing the pawn storm is risky, opening critical lines around your own king while simultaneously attempting to disrupt black's solid setup. The ensuing chaos could favor either side, depending on precise calculation and reactive play. The knight's retreat to e7, a seemingly passive repositioning, skillfully sidesteps the immediate pawn storm brewing on the kingside, conserving material while preparing to reinforce the central dark squares and potentially launch a counterattack through the d-file or a future b-pawn advance. Shifting the queen to d2 aims to support a potential e4 advance, contesting the central space black has aggressively claimed with their f5 and g4 pawn push. Black reinforces the central pawn chain with this piece maneuver, aiming to solidify the kingside and prevent white's e4 push. A strategic gambit to seize the central dark squares, challenging black's pawn structure and potentially opening lines for attacking pressure. Black initiates a strategic retreat, repositioning the knight to a less exposed square and creating a more solid pawn structure, thereby aiming to quell white's central pawn advance and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queenside later in the game. Opening the rook's path to the center signals a serious intention to contest the d-file, perhaps preparing for a central pawn push or a defensive maneuver against black's burgeoning kingside initiative. This pawn thrust, 16, c6, directly challenges white's centralized knight and aims to undermine its presence in the d5 outpost, a crucial positional element white has meticulously built. By creating this pawn chain, black seeks to gain a foothold in the queenside, potentially opening lines for their own pieces and restricting white's development. However, it also creates a pawn majority on the queenside for white down the line if the exchange occurs, so black must be wary of creating weaknesses while pursuing this expansion. The knight's rerouting to c3 is a curious repositioning, potentially aiming to reinforce the d5 outpost or perhaps to prepare for a central pawn push if the opportunity arises, though it feels a bit slow given black's aggressive kingside pawn advance. This maneuvering invites a deeper look into white's defensive setup and how it might withstand black's encroaching forces. Shattering the central pawn chain with this capture immediately opens lines, creating dynamic imbalances and forcing white to react to the liberated g-file, potentially exposing their monarch or demanding a careful defensive setup. Unlocking the d-file offers white a clear path to pressure black's position, potentially opening lines for the queen and rook into the heart of the enemy camp. Black's pawn push on h5 immediately injects a dose of aggression, pushing beyond mere defensive preparation and aiming to seize kingside space, potentially creating weaknesses in white's pawn structure or forcing a reaction that opens lines toward the enemy king. Initiating a regrouping maneuver, the knight repositions to c2, seeking a more active role and preparing to support a potential advance on the queenside, while simultaneously clearing the d3 square for future pawn pushes or piece development. Opening a daring assault on the kingside, this pawn thrust aims to shatter white's defensive structure and create immediate attacking chances around the vulnerable monarch. Focusing on activating the rook for central influence, this repositioning maneuver aims to prepare for potential central pawn breaks or to bolster the defense should black's kingside ambitions lead to overextension, while simultaneously clearing the d-file for other pieces. Black consolidates their central grip, preparing to contest the open files and reinforce their kingside presence. This regrouping maneuver aims to silence white's initiative and re-establish dynamic balance. The knight vacates its post, preparing for a potential regrouping, perhaps to the more active f4 square, thereby challenging black's extended pawn structure and offering a more robust central presence. This repositioning also clears the way for the d-pawn's advance, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and open lines. Unlocking a diagonal for the bishop offers a more active placement, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the king's side if the pawn chain breaks. The bishop now eyes the queen side, potentially probing weaknesses created by black's aggressive pawn advance, while simultaneously reinforcing the d3 square and preparing to redeploy to a more active diagonal if the opportunity arises. Black reroutes the rook to the 7th rank, an aggressive repositioning aimed at the unprotected white king and potentially creating a battery with the queen. Shifting the bishop to a more passive square like f2 aims to reposition it to the king side, potentially supporting a future attack or preparing to contest the g-file should it open. It's a seemingly quiet maneuver, but it signals a change in white's attacking intentions, perhaps abandoning the queenside pressure for a more direct assault on black's king. Observe how this bishop's eventual placement will influence the dynamic of the g-file and the defense of black's monarch. Pushing the h-pawn, black initiates a daring, albeit potentially reckless, assault, aiming to pry open white's kingside through sheer pawn pressure. But it sacrifices valuable kingside pawn structure and central influence for unclear gains. A strategic retreat, the bishop vacates the diagonal, eyeing the queenside and potentially freeing the knight for central action, though it relinquishes control over the crucial dark squares near the king. Black's queen now anchors the queenside, preparing for a potential advance of the queenside pawns or to support a more decisive attack on the kingside, while also eyeing the potentially weak d3 pawn and the white king's general vicinity. The knight's relocation to c3 aims to re-establish central influence and potentially support an advance on the queenside, but it ignores the immediate threats building on the kingside where black's pawn storm is gaining momentum. This positioning feels passive given the ongoing pawn push from black's side. Opening up the queenside is an interesting idea, aiming to introduce counterplay and potentially activate the a8 rook, but it significantly weakens the queenside pawn structure and could invite a dangerous initiative for white on that flank if black isn't careful with subsequent play. Opening the h-file for attack, the knight now occupies a dynamic outpost, disrupting black's pawn structure and threatening to exploit the exposed king. The knight retreats, abandoning the active central square and preparing to reposition, hinting at a potential defensive maneuver or a surprise flanking action on the king side, while white's bishop on d4 exerts pressure. Unlocking the queen side, white aims to create dynamic play and pressure on the flank, while black's central pawn structure remains somewhat passive. Prioritizing the opening of the d-file for his rooks, black aims to activate his dormant forces and potentially challenge white's central grip, a timely maneuver given white's rather static setup and lack of immediate threats. Relocating the knight to b3 is a curious maneuver, seemingly abandoning the central fight and the open e-file, but it prepares to join the queenside pawn storm with its brethren, perhaps aiming to outflank the black army or secure a stable post from which to influence the board. Embracing the queenside expansion, black prepares to reposition the rook for potential activity on the d-file, hinting at a strategic shift in the center. Initiating the exchange of queens often signals a pivot towards simplification, and here, white seeks to dislodge black's established dark square influence. Reclaiming that bishop opens a crucial diagonal for your queen and signals a shift towards a more dynamic phase. Consider how this might influence future pawn breaks, particularly on the queen side. Instigating a pawn storm on the queen side with a timely advance, aiming to exploit weaknesses and create dynamic play, even if it temporarily neglects the king side. Securing the monarch's escape route, this maneuver aims to reposition the king to a safer square, anticipating potential pawn storms and opening lines for its defensive pieces. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to either reinforce the queenside initiative or prepare for a central pawn thrust. The rook's repositioning to e7, while seemingly passive, aims to untangle black's pieces and potentially prepare for a later advance on the king side or a switch to the d-file, seeking to activate its dormant status. Sizing up the queen side, white probes for weaknesses and potential entry points into black's territory with this pawn advance, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space and possibly create opportunities for piece play on the expanded flank. Shifting the king to a more active square like g6, even with the pawn storm on the king side, is a bold bid to participate in the unfolding drama, perhaps anticipating a simplification that could lead to an endgame where it's less exposed. Recapturing the knight with this knight reestablishes a pawn chain and prepares to contest the open d-file, potentially challenging black's queenside expansion. Preparing to dislodge that pesky knight on c3, black solidifies their bishop's influence on the long diagonal, aiming to pry open the queenside and potentially create weaknesses for white's king, which currently feels quite exposed. Refocusing the rook to the central file acknowledges that black's king has found a temporary but potentially precarious haven, and this redeployment aims to create counterpressure rather than directly challenging the immediate king's safety. This retreat of the rook signals a reevaluation of the queenside expansion, as black now aims to bolster the kingside's defenses and potentially reposition the rook to a more active role, perhaps eyeing the f-file if it can be opened. Re-establishing central pressure and preparing for potential piece exchanges seems to be the aim here, looking to consolidate white's slightly cramped position. Daringly, black injects tension into the center, aiming to pry open lines and activate dormant pieces. This pawn thrust challenges white's central structure and seeks to disrupt their coordinated blockade. Liberating the bishop from its initial outpost now sets up a potential blockade on the queenside, aiming to cramp black's queenside expansion and deny useful squares to its pieces. Sensing the imminent closure of the queenside, black's choice of reaffirming queen activity on the c-file seems almost reactive, a sidestep rather than a proactive maneuver to confront the looming bishop's dominance. Repositioning the knight to e2 allows for a potential regrouping, aiming to bring it back into the central fray or even to f4 for increased pressure, while simultaneously defending against any immediate threats on the kingside and preparing for a more solid pawn structure development. Undermining white's pawn chain with this exchange opens critical lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rook, to penetrate the weakened queenside. The pawn push opens a diagonal for the queen and aims to dismantle black's queenside structure, potentially isolating the knight on b8. Unleashing the rook to challenge control of the semi-open c-file offers dynamic possibilities, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the now exposed kingside. The bishop's advance to the c5 square is an attempt to sever the communication between black's queenside pawns and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. Stepping back to the sanctuary of e8, the black rook aims to solidify its defensive posture, anticipating the white bishop's potential incursions along the now-open diagonals after the recent exchanges. A strategic repositioning aims to consolidate the bishop's influence on the kingside, while the opponent's rooks appear somewhat uncoordinated on the central files. Unleashing the knight to e4 creates fascinating tactical possibilities, potentially opening lines towards white's castled king and forcing concessions. The bishop ventures forward, a seemingly quiet advance, yet it subtly aims to disrupt black's intricate pawn structure, potentially preparing to exploit the newly opened diagonals for future attacks or piece repositioning. Liberating the bishop from its cramped position on the queenside clears a path for the queen and could help establish more active play in the center. The knight's redeployment to d4 significantly reshapes the central battle, aiming to exploit the now-open diagonal and potentially coordinate with other pieces for a kingside assault, while simultaneously pressuring black's advanced pawns and forcing a recalculation of defensive lines. Unleashing the knight from its passive post behind the pawns, this maneuver aims to reclaim central influence and potentially attack white's weakened queenside structure, a direct consequence of the prior pawn storm. Re-establishing central influence with the rook offers a dynamic shift, threatening to penetrate the queenside and exploit any lingering weaknesses created by black's pawn advances. Exchanging the rooks here abandons any ambition of maintaining the queenside pawn mass, simplifying the position and forcing black into an endgame where the active white knight on e5 will be a significant threat. The pawn's advance finally breaks free, aiming to establish a central presence and potentially threaten the black queen, while simultaneously opening up new attacking avenues for the remaining pieces. Embracing the unleashed queen for a potential breakthrough, Black steers their most powerful piece into the fray, hoping to exploit the newfound open lines and pressure White's now somewhat isolated monarch. Securing the passed pawn's advance while shoring up the queenside offers a crucial advantage as White repositions for the endgame. The bishop's excursion to c4 after a long journey seems to aim at disrupting White's d-pawn control and potentially creating new avenues for counterplay, though it might leave the knight on d6 somewhat exposed. Unleashing the queen to exert pressure on the queenside, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns. Sacrificing the bishop here opens lines of attack for your opponent's remaining pieces, creating dangerous potential for a swift checkmate. Seizing the open knight file, the rook now has a clear path to participate in the fray. The knight's journey to c4 injects immediate dynamism into the position, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially open lines. Repositioning the queen back to the deuce row, seeking to either double rooks on the e-file or prepare for a queen sortie to the kingside, aiming to exploit Black's somewhat exposed monarch. Re-establishing a passed pawn threat on the queenside, but at the cost of potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure and inviting a tactical skirmish. The knight's hop to c5 aims to exploit the exposed Black king and the potential weakness of the d6 pawn, while also preparing to redeploy to a more active square, perhaps d7 or e6, to disrupt Black's coordination. The pawn advance opens a critical diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit the momentarily exposed king position and potentially create threats on the kingside. Liberating the knight from its cramped post on c3 opens up a tantalizing fork opportunity on b7, aiming to disrupt Black's central pawn structure and potentially win material. The knight's retreat to d7 aims to regroup, protecting the now exposed b7 pawn and preparing to contest the open central files, though it surrenders initiative and invites further pawn advances. Unveiling the queen to potentially exploit the d-file, aiming to disrupt Black's knight coordination and perhaps create mating threats or win material if the Black king remains exposed. A bold attempt to seize the initiative by activating the knight, though it leaves the pawn structure somewhat exposed. Unlocking the potential of the queenside with a pawn advance forces a decision on Black's tightly packed pieces. Unlocking a new dimension of attack, this queen redirection aims to create critical threats on the kingside and pressure White's overextended pawn structure. Seizing the undefended c6 pawn opens up a clear diagonal for your queen, potentially creating immediate threats against the Black king and destabilizing their pawn structure. Sacrificing a knight to create a powerful passed pawn offers a glimmer of hope in a precarious situation, but the potential for immediate material loss and a compromised king's safety is immense. Pivoting the queen to the first rank now aims to achieve a breakthrough by supporting a potential advance of the g-pawn and threatening to infiltrate Black's position along the first rank, potentially targeting weaknesses around the king. Sensing the knight's trap on the second rank, this maneuver aims to create a desperate escape route before White's rook can fully dominate the open c-file.